I stood on the cobblestone street of a small Spanish town, my suitcase still by my side, watching the car disappear into the distance. My son was behind the wheel, his friends sat beside him, laughing so loudly that their voices echoed long after the engine faded away. My heart sank. My own child, my flesh and blood, had left me stranded, no warning, just gone. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that maybe they'd circle back, maybe they just needed space. But the minutes stretched into an hour, and the truth pressed down harder and harder. I wasn't forgotten. I was discarded. A wave of humiliation burned through me. Imagine raising someone, sacrificing decades of your life, only for them to laugh as you're left behind in a country that isn't your home. I didn't even know the language well enough to ask for help. All I knew was that I was alone, unwanted, and deeply betrayed. But here's the part no one saw coming. That moment, standing alone on foreign streets, wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a chain of choices that would change everything. Choices that would uncover truths about my son, reveal hidden betrayals, and push me to rebuild in ways I never thought possible. This is not just a story about being abandoned. It's about betrayal. It's about secrets buried under years of family loyalty. It's about heartbreak so raw it shakes you to your core. And it's about a revenge that came quietly, not through shouting or fighting, but through strength, through independence, and through walking away from everything I thought I couldn't live without. And as you hear my story unfold, remember, betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it comes from the people you love most, the very ones you believed would never hurt you. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has reached, because no parent should ever feel the kind of betrayal I did. I was a woman in my late 50s, long past the years of playground pickups and late-night homework battles, yet still carrying the weight of motherhood as if it were stitched into my very skin. I had raised my son, Michael, almost entirely on my own. His father had left when he was young, and the responsibility of shaping him into a man fell squarely on my shoulders. I worked double shifts, cut corners on my own dreams, and swallowed countless disappointments so he could have opportunities one never did. Over the years, that sacrifice built a strange mixture of pride and exhaustion. Michael had grown into adulthood, yet our bond never felt steady. It was fragile, almost conditional, tied to his moods, his choices, and his ability to see me as more than just the woman who provided for him. By the time this trip came around, our relationship was already strained. We rarely spent quality time together, and when we did, conversations often ended in silence or tension. Still, I wanted to believe there was hope, that if we could step away from the routines and arguments of daily life, maybe we could remember what connected us. That's why, when Michael suggested traveling to Spain with some of his friends, I agreed. My heart clung to the idea that shared experiences might stitch together the frayed edges of our relationship. Spain was supposed to be a bridge, not a battlefield. The idea of walking through narrow streets, sharing meals under the warm glow of foreign evenings, and laughing together like we once did filled me with a quiet sense of anticipation. I told myself this was our chance to reclaim something that had slipped away with time, resentment, and distance. But even before the plane touched down, there were warning signs I tried to ignore. Michael seemed more invested in his friends' company than in mine. He spoke to them with an ease I hadn't seen in years, his laughter quick and frequent, while his conversations with me felt short, clipped, almost impatient. They were young men, all in their late 20s, loud and careless in their humor, making jokes that stung in ways they didn't seem to notice, or maybe they did and they simply didn't care. I brushed it off at first, convincing myself that they were just teasing, that I was being too sensitive. They made remarks about how mothers always worry too much, how parents don't understand real freedom, how I should be grateful just to be included. I laughed politely, though inside I felt the weight of their words pressing down. It wasn't just humor. It was dismissal. It was the erasure of my role, of my presence. Michael, instead of standing beside me, often joined their laughter. He rolled his eyes when I asked questions about plans or safety. He brushed off my concerns as if they were embarrassing interruptions rather than the voice of someone who had held him through fevers, scraped knees, and heartbreaks. I started to notice the way he shifted in his chair when I spoke too long, the way he leaned closer to his friends when they whispered jokes at my expense. Each small gesture was like a pinprick, not enough to wound on its own, but together forming a pattern I could no longer deny. The first days of the trip revealed a reality I had been avoiding for years. My son no longer saw me as an anchor. To him, I was baggage, something to tolerate, not cherish. I wanted to believe I was wrong, that this was only temporary, but deep down I felt the foundation of my hope cracking. I told myself that families go through rough patches, that love is resilient, that respect can be repaired, but the truth lingered in the quiet moments, in the way he avoided my eyes when I caught him mocking me with his friends, in the way he chose them over me again and again. Still I held on. I told myself this trip could change things, that maybe one evening, sitting across from each other with the noise of his friends dulled by the hum of a foreign city, we might find common ground again. That maybe he would remember that I wasn't just a woman tagging along, I was his mother, the person who had given him everything I could, even when it left me with nothing. But instead of finding closeness, I began to sense distance growing wider by the day. A distance that would soon turn into something I never imagined possible. At the time I didn't know it, but the small cracks I felt in those early days weren't random. They were the opening notes of a betrayal that would leave me stranded, humiliated, and forced to confront the painful truth about the son I thought I knew. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke one evening. We were sitting in a small restaurant tucked into the heart of a busy Spanish square, the kind of place where families gathered, the smell of grilled seafood drifting through the air, and the chatter of tourists mingling with the voices of locals. It should have been a night to savor good food, warm atmosphere, the kind of memory that stays with you for years. But for me, that night marked the beginning of an unraveling I could no longer ignore. Michael's friends had been drinking, their laughter loud and careless, their jokes sharper than usual. They poked fun at me for asking too many questions about the menu, teased me for trying to learn simple phrases in Spanish, mocked my slower pace when walking through crowded streets. On the surface, it might have sounded harmless to outsiders, but to me, every word carried a sting. They weren't just laughing at a tourist's mistakes. They were laughing at me, at the woman who had given up so much of her life so my son could sit there, confident and unbothered, at that very table. I tried to remain composed, but each remark chipped away at my patience. When one of them jokingly suggested I should sit this one out, because I was killing the vibe, something inside me hardened. I turned to my son, waiting for him to defend me, to remind them that I was not just some tag-along stranger. But instead of standing up for me, he smirked, as if embarrassed by my presence. That smirk was the breaking point. I straightened in my chair, my voice firm but controlled. I told them plainly that respect was not optional, that I would not be treated like a burden. Years of silence, years of biting my tongue for the sake of peace, spilled out in that moment. I reminded Michael, in front of his friends, that I was not someone to be dismissed. I was his mother. I had raised him alone. I had carried responsibilities that would have crushed many, and I deserved more than ridicule. The table grew quiet for a moment, the weight of my words hanging in the air. But then, instead of support, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression tight, his voice sharp. He told me I was overreacting, that I was making a scene, that I always found a way to ruin moments. His friends nodded, emboldened by his stance, and suddenly I was no longer just the butt of their jokes. I was the problem. It was as though years of sacrifice had been erased in an instant. My son, the boy I had fed when I had nothing, the child I had comforted in the dark when he was afraid, the young man whose college tuition I had scraped together penny by penny, now sat across from me treating me like an obstacle to his happiness. My words of defense became fuel for their mockery. And Michael, instead of seeing my pain, laughed with them. The noise of the restaurant faded in my mind, replaced by the pounding of my heart. I stared at him, searching for the boy I once knew, the boy who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street, the boy who whispered that he loved me before falling asleep. But all I saw was a man surrounded by peers, desperate to prove he wasn't tethered to the woman who gave him life. The argument spilled into sharper tones. I refused to back down, my voice steady, even as tears threatened to surface. I told him boundaries mattered. That respect was the foundation of every relationship, including ours. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I simply held my ground, even as he leaned further away from me with every word I spoke. His friends smirked, exchanging glances that said they were winning, that I was losing control of the very person I had once believed would always stand beside me. By the time the meal ended, nothing was resolved. The plates were cleared, but the damage remained heavy between us. Michael avoided my gaze, speaking only to his friends, as if I weren't even at the table. I sat in silence, tasting bitterness in every bite I forced myself to swallow. I wanted to reach across the table, to shake him, to remind him of the countless nights I went without so he could have enough, but I held back. Instead, I sat still, realizing something I had avoided for years. The distance between us was no longer invisible. It was real. It was growing. And it was about to stretch into something irreversible. That night, walking back through the narrow streets, their laughter trailing behind me, I felt it like a shadow creeping over my shoulder. The betrayal I had sensed was no longer unspoken. It was unfolding in front of me, brick by brick, moment by moment. I didn't know it then, but this fight wasn't just about boundaries or respect. It was the prelude to something far more devastating. A decision that would leave me stranded and force me to confront the harshest truth a parent can ever face. That sometimes, love is not enough to hold a family together. The night after our argument sat heavy on me. I barely slept, my mind replaying every word, every gesture, every look of irritation in Michael's eyes. I told myself that the morning would bring clarity, that maybe he'd feel some guilt for siding against me so openly. Mothers learn to live on hope, even when the evidence tells us otherwise. That hope was the only thing that steadied me when I woke to the sound of him and his friends laughing in the hallway of the small inn we were staying in. Their voices rose and fell, careless, free of any thought about me. We had plans to drive out that day, to explore nearby villages. I tried to brush myself up, forcing a smile as I carried my bag downstairs. They were already by the car, waiting, joking, tossing comments back and forth. I could feel the tension wrap itself around me like a rope I couldn't escape. Michael glanced at me quickly, then back at his friends, his expression unreadable. We piled into the car, the atmosphere thick with the kind of laughter that isn't shared, but pointed. They whispered, exchanged looks, then broke into grins as if they were plotting something amusing. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. I didn't want to invite more ridicule, not after the dinner that had already shown me where I stood in their eyes. At some point, we stopped in a small town. The streets were narrow, cobblestones uneven underfoot, lined with shuttered windows and the faint smell of bread drifting from a bakery. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a postcard, picturesque but isolated. Michael told me to get out for a bit, stretch my legs. I obeyed, trusting that maybe this was his way of cooling down, of giving us space before continuing our journey. I adjusted my bag, stepped out, and turned my back for only a moment. When I turned around again, the car doors slammed. I heard the engine rev and then I saw it. Michael behind the wheel, his friends egging him on, laughter spilling out of the open windows. My heart lurched as the tires ground against the cobblestones, pulling the car forward, faster and faster until it disappeared down the narrow road. Their voices echoed in the air. "Let's see how she gets back," followed by roaring laughter that grew faint and finally vanished with the car itself. I froze. My feet felt nailed to the ground. My first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Surely they'd return. Surely this was a twisted attempt at a joke, one that would last a few minutes before they'd come back, laughing at my expense but back nonetheless. But the minutes stretched long, the street emptied, and the pit in my stomach widened into a cavern. I reached for my phone, only to realize the signal was spotty, my roaming plan unreliable. The battery blinked red. My wallet held only a few euros, barely enough for a drink, certainly not enough to get me across towns. I asked a passerby for directions, but the words tumbled out in Spanish I couldn't understand, gestures pointing me toward places I'd never heard of. Panic began to set in. My breaths grew shallow, my thoughts spiraled into questions I couldn't answer. Where could I go? How could I find them? Why would my own son think this was acceptable? I wandered through the narrow lanes searching for a sign, for a familiar face, for anything that tethered me to safety. But every corner looked the same, every street unfamiliar. The weight of my suitcase cut into my hand, each step heavier than the last. And with each passing moment, reality pressed harder against me. They weren't coming back. This wasn't just a prank that went too far. This was abandonment. A deliberate decision to leave me stranded, humiliated and powerless in a place I didn't know. The humiliation cut deeper than the fear. People passed me, some glancing my way with curiosity, others ignoring me entirely. I wanted to scream, to tell them what had just happened, but the words wouldn't come out. How do you explain being discarded by your own child without choking on shame? My legs trembled, my throat tightened, and my eyes burned with tears I fought to hold back. Hours felt like days as I tried to find a way out, my heart racing each time I thought I heard the sound of an engine approaching. But no familiar car returned. No son stepping out to tell me it was all a joke. The silence of the streets answered me more clearly than any words could. I had been left behind and I was on my own. And that was the last time I saw my son for weeks. If you're still watching this, please like and subscribe. It tells me you care about stories like this, stories of mothers who gave everything and got nothing in return. And don't forget to comment where you're tuning in from. I want to see how far this story goes. The sun dipped lower, casting the narrow streets in amber light, and with it came a new fear. I had never felt so utterly alone, not even in the darkest days of raising Michael as a single mother. Back then, I had my little boy beside me, his small hand gripping mine, his laughter filling the silence of our modest apartment. But here in this foreign town I had nothing. No phone signal, no safe place to go, no familiar face to lean on. As the air cooled and shadows stretched across the walls, the hunger hit me. My stomach knotted with an ache that wasn't just physical but emotional too. I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and now, even if I wanted to, I couldn't. The coins in my pocket wouldn't cover a proper meal. I pressed my back against a stone wall, slid down until I sat on the cold ground, and I cried. Not the quiet tears I sometimes shed alone at home, but deep, heaving sobs that tore through me. Every sound of laughter I had heard earlier from Michael and his friends replayed in my mind, mocking me, reminding me of the deliberate cruelty that had brought me here. When the tears subsided, I lifted my head and forced myself to look around. A group of elderly women passed by, carrying grocery bags, their voices rising and falling in warm conversation. For a brief moment, I envied them, their comfort, their sense of belonging, their connection to one another. One of them noticed me, stopped, and said something in Spanish I couldn't understand. I shook my head, embarrassed, but she must have seen the desperation in my eyes. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small loaf of bread, pressing it into my hands with a nod. My throat tightened again, but this time not from sorrow. This time it was gratitude. A stranger, with nothing to gain, had shown me more kindness in seconds than my own son had in days. That small act was a lifeline. I nibbled the bread slowly, savoring each bite, not just for the sustenance but for what it symbolized, hope. As darkness fell, I realized I had to find somewhere to stay. The idea of sleeping on the street terrified me. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound of footsteps behind me made me shiver. I wandered until I spotted a small church at the edge of the square, its doors slightly ajar, a warm glow spilling from inside. Desperation pushed me forward. Inside the air was cool and quiet. A few candles flickered near the altar, casting soft light against the wooden pews. I sat at the very back, clutching my bag tightly to my chest. For the first time in years I prayed, not for wealth, not for comfort, but for strength. I prayed for the courage to survive whatever came next, because I knew no one was coming to rescue me. I was invisible to my son now, discarded like a burden he no longer wanted to carry. The thought burned, but it also lit a small fire inside me. If he didn't care whether I survived, then I would survive for myself. That night, I drifted in and out of restless sleep on the hard wooden pew, waking each time a door creaked or the wind howled outside. My body ached. My mind replayed every moment leading up to this abandonment, but underneath the exhaustion, something shifted. I realized that survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter, it was about refusing to let his betrayal break me. The next morning, a young priest found me in the pews. He didn't speak much English, but his eyes softened when he saw my worn face and red eyes. He gestured toward a side room, where he brought me a cup of warm tea and a small plate of cheese and fruit. I wanted to refuse out of shame, but my body betrayed me, and I ate, tears streaming silently down my cheeks as I whispered thank you again and again. With his limited words, he helped me find a small hostel nearby that would take me in for a night. I used the last of my money, knowing it wouldn't last long, but the relief of having a bed, however simple, was overwhelming. I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past 2 days replaying like a cruel film. My son's laughter, the sound of the engine pulling away, the stillness when I realized they weren't coming back. Each memory cut like glass, but lying there, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't let this define me as a victim. I would endure. I would find a way forward. The following days were a blur of trial and error. With no steady money, I learned to survive on scraps and kindness. I visited the local market where vendors, after realizing I couldn't afford much, sometimes slipped me a piece of fruit or bread at no cost. I discovered a cafe that let me sit for hours with a single cup of coffee, allowing me to rest and observe life around me. The waitresses would smile softly, refilling my water without asking for anything in return. Their small mercies built a fragile but steady bridge between despair and resilience. I taught myself bits of Spanish from signs, menus, and overheard conversations, enough to ask for water, for directions, to thank people properly. Each word I learned gave me a sense of control, a reminder that I wasn't entirely helpless. At night, I returned to the church, sometimes slipping into the pews, other times resting on the stone steps outside when the doors were locked. The nights were cold, but I wrapped my arms tightly around myself, whispering stories from Michael's childhood, not to forgive him but to remind myself that I had once been needed, once been loved, at least by the little boy he used to be. The contrast between strangers' kindness and my son's cruelty gnawed at me. I couldn't understand how people who owed me nothing could extend compassion, while the boy I had sacrificed everything for discarded me like I was nothing. The truth was painful but undeniable. Love doesn't guarantee loyalty, and blood doesn't always guarantee family. As the days turned into weeks, I hardened. Not into bitterness but into something stronger. My tears became less frequent. My steps grew steadier. I began to recognize faces in the market, to nod at the women who had once given me bread, to smile back at the children who waved as I passed. Piece by piece, I was stitching myself together, not as the same woman who had arrived on this trip hoping to reconnect with her son, but as someone new. Someone who had been broken and had no choice but to rebuild. And though I didn't know it then, every moment of survival was preparing me for the silent revenge that waited just ahead. Every act of cruelty from my son had planted seeds, and now those seeds were slowly, quietly taking root inside me. In the quiet hours of those long Spanish days, when I wasn't searching for food or a place to rest my head, I found myself trapped in memories. Memories of Michael as a little boy. Memories I had locked away to keep myself moving forward, now breaking free in waves I couldn't stop. I would sit in the corner of the market square, a piece of bread in my hands, and suddenly I was back in our tiny kitchen in Ohio, standing over a pot of pasta while a small boy tugged at my sleeve, asking when dinner would be ready. His eyes were so wide then, so full of trust, so sure that I was his whole world. I lived for those eyes, for that certainty. I had raised him alone, and that had not been easy. His father had walked out when Michael was barely 3, leaving me with bills stacked on the counter, a fridge that was nearly empty, and a heart that had shattered into pieces I didn't think I could ever glue back together. But somehow I did. I took on double shifts. I sold my wedding ring to cover rent. I swallowed my pride and accepted help when neighbors left bags of groceries on my porch. All because of Michael. Every decision I made, every sacrifice was for him. I remembered nights when I would come home from work long after dark, exhausted, my body aching, only to find him asleep on the couch, waiting for me. Sometimes he'd have a drawing in his hands, a picture of the two of us, stick figures smiling under a sun, words scribbled across the page. Me and Mom. Those drawings were worth more to me than diamonds. They were proof that even if the world had abandoned me, my son hadn't. At least that's what I believed. But as he grew older, things began to change. His laughter was still there, but it carried a sharper edge. He began to pull away, finding comfort in friends who mocked responsibility and chased recklessness. I told myself it was just teenage rebellion, that he would outgrow it. I excused the rolled eyes, the slammed doors, the careless words. I told myself that deep down, he was still that little boy who drew pictures of us under the sun. I refused to see the distance for what it was. A growing chasm between us, one I couldn't bridge with love alone. I thought about the birthdays I worked through just to keep food on the table, how I made up for them with small gestures. A cupcake at midnight, a whispered promise that next year would be better. I thought about the football games I missed because I was cleaning offices late into the night, how he stood on the field scanning the crowd and not finding me there. That guilt has lived in my bones for years. I wondered, sitting in that foreign town, if that guilt had festered into something else inside him. Resentment, anger, maybe even hatred. And then there were the moments I truly overlooked, the shadows I had ignored. The way he sometimes spoke about me to his friends when he didn't know I was listening, calling me too much, too controlling, too old-fashioned. The way he bragged about how easily he could talk me into paying for things, how he knew I'd always cover for him no matter what. I laughed it off at the time, telling myself boys said stupid things to fit in. But sitting alone on that stone bench in Spain, I realized those weren't just jokes. They were truths I had chosen not to face. I began to question everything. Was this abandonment in that town really a prank, a thoughtless moment fueled by alcohol and immaturity? Or was it something else? A deliberate choice to rid himself of me, to leave me behind as though I were nothing more than baggage? The thought was almost too painful to carry, but it sank deeper into me with every passing day. The more I remembered, the clearer the picture became. I had always told myself that Michael was lost, that he needed guidance, that my love could save him. But perhaps I had blinded myself to something darker, something he had been carrying for years, a resentment I couldn't fix with late-night talks or endless sacrifice. Maybe the boy who once looked at me with wide eyes full of trust had been replaced long before that trip, and I was too stubborn, too hopeful to admit it. Each flashback cut me open in new ways. The nights of staying up late sewing patches onto his jeans so he wouldn't feel embarrassed at school. The times I went without winter coat so he could have one. The college fund I scraped together only to watch him squander it on nights out and broken promises. I had given everything. And yet in his eyes it was never enough. I told myself these were the thoughts of a woman who had been broken by betrayal, that maybe I was overthinking. But deep down, something inside me whispered otherwise. That leaving me stranded hadn't been an accident, hadn't been a prank that went too far. It had been a choice. A cold, calculated choice. And though I didn't fully understand it then, the truth was already circling me, waiting for its moment to strike. Because what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known as I sat there, replaying every sacrifice, every overlooked moment, was that my son's betrayal wasn't just born from immaturity. It wasn't just carelessness or peer pressure. No, it was part of something much darker. Something that had been growing beneath the surface for years. Something I was about to discover, piece by piece, until the entire truth revealed itself like a wound split open. And when that truth came, it would change everything I thought I knew about my son, about myself, and about the life I had built around him. When the days in Spain began to blend together, when the markets in the church no longer felt like steps toward healing but reminders of how small I had become, I made a decision. I could not go back to the United States, not yet. The thought of returning felt like walking into a courtroom where the world would ask me why I was left, why my own son abandoned me, and I had no strength to relive that humiliation. I needed something different. I needed a place where no one knew me, where I could begin again without the shadow of Michael hanging over me. That's how I found myself crossing into Portugal. The journey wasn't grand. It wasn't like the movies, where a woman suddenly discovers freedom with a suitcase and a map. Mine was messy, filled with worry about money, about language, about survival. But something inside me pushed forward. I told myself that if I could endure those nights on stone steps in Spain, I could survive anywhere. And Portugal, with its rolling hills, its ocean breeze, and the rhythm of a life slower than the one I'd known back home, welcomed me like a secret I hadn't expected to find. I landed in a small coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where faces were familiar even if words weren't. The streets smelled of bread in the morning and grilled fish in the evening. The sea was always in the background, whispering promises of calm. I carried little with me, just a bag of clothes, a handful of coins, and a heart bruised but still beating. On my second day there, I stumbled upon a cafe tucked into a corner, its windows fogged from steam, the air spilling out rich with the smell of coffee. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Anna, caught me standing outside. She waved me in. I hesitated, but hunger and the warmth in her eyes pulled me through the door. I bought a coffee with the last of my coins and sat in the corner, ready to nurse it for hours. But Anna noticed. She didn't scold me for lingering. Instead, she brought over a plate of pastries, setting it on the table without a word. That gesture broke something in me. I ate quietly, tears slipping down my face, and though she didn't understand English, she placed her hand on mine. That was the first moment I felt seen again. Not as a burden, not as an embarrassment, but as a human being. Days turned into weeks and Anna offered me work. Nothing glamorous, washing dishes, wiping tables, carrying trays. But it was work and it gave me purpose. I took it, grateful beyond words. My hands, once worn from years of office cleaning back home, now smelled of soap and coffee beans. My shoulders, once weighed down by shame, began to straighten as the routine gave me something to hold on to. The other workers welcomed me, some with broken English, others with simple smiles. I began to learn phrases in Portuguese, stumbling at first, laughing at my mistakes, but slowly finding my voice again. Each day I woke before sunrise, walked through the narrow streets to the cafe, and let the rhythm of work guide me. I cleaned. I served. I listened, and in that listening, I began to piece together fragments of my own healing. I realized that life without Michael's demands, without his manipulation and his friends' mockery, was a life that felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, bracing for the next careless remark, the next entitled request. I was simply living, and the simplicity was beautiful. One evening, after the cafe closed, Anna sat with me outside, the two of us watching the ocean. She spoke softly, words I barely understood, but I caught one phrase repeated again and again: family of choice. I didn't need a dictionary to understand her. Family wasn't always blood. Family could be kindness, shared bread, silent understanding. I felt a warmth spread in my chest that I hadn't felt since Michael was a little boy with drawings in his hands. It was in Portugal that I started to taste freedom, not just from my circumstances, but from the chains I had wrapped around myself for decades. The belief that my worth came from sacrifice, that my value was tied to being Michael's mother. I was more than that. I was a woman rebuilding, rediscovering, reclaiming. And each smile from Anna, each wave from the townspeople, each sunrise over the ocean reminded me that my story wasn't over. It was changing. And if you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe, and share it. I want to know if this story of rebuilding and strength reaches mothers, fathers, and children across the world. Drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from. I'll be reading them. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a future. I began to save small amounts of money from the cafe, little by little, until I could afford more than just survival. I bought a journal and started writing again. Letters to myself, reflections on the woman I was becoming. I went on walks by the cliffs, breathing in the salt air, watching the waves crash and break against the rocks, and I realized that was me. Broken and battered, but still standing, still powerful in my own way. Yet as much as I embraced this new chapter, as much as I convinced myself that I had been forgotten by Michael and his friends, I was wrong. My peace was only temporary. Because betrayal has a way of following you, no matter how far you run. And just when I thought I was forgotten, he found me. I remember the day so vividly because it began like any other. The morning sun lit the streets of the town in Portugal, casting soft light over the tiled rooftops. I had walked to the cafe early, as I always did, the sea air brushing against my face, the rhythm of my steps steady, purposeful. I felt almost settled. My hands carried the weight of bread and fruit from the market, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a stranger anymore. I felt like someone who belonged, someone who had carved out a small corner of peace in a world that had once turned its back on me. But that morning, peace shattered. I was wiping down a table in the cafe when I felt it. Eyes on me. A shadow fell across the doorway. My breath caught before I even looked up because something inside me already knew. I turned slowly, cloth still in hand, and there he was. Michael. My son. Taller than I remembered, thinner perhaps, but with the same restless energy in his stance. His eyes swept across the cafe, searching, and when they landed on me, his lips parted in disbelief. For a moment, time froze. My chest ached with 1,000 memories colliding at once. My little boy with drawings in his hand, my teenager with doors slammed in anger, my grown son laughing as he left me behind in Spain. I didn't know which version of him stood before me. All I knew was that my world, carefully rebuilt piece by fragile piece, was trembling again. He stepped inside, and his voice carried across the room, louder than it needed to be. Mom. It wasn't the word itself that broke me. It was the way it sounded, like a question, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. I stood still, frozen as he walked closer. I've been looking everywhere for you, he said, running a hand through his hair, his voice a mix of relief and exasperation. Do you have any idea what I went through trying to track you down? Those words hit me harder than I expected. What he went through. My heart burned with anger, but my lips refused to move. I let him continue, my silence louder than any response. Look, he said, his tone shifting quickly. About what happened in Spain. It wasn't that serious. It was just a joke. We didn't think you'd actually take it so hard. You're too sensitive sometimes, Mom. We were gonna come back for you. You should have waited. Just a joke. Too sensitive. The phrases stabbed like knives. I felt the cafe around me blur, the clinking of cups, the low hum of Portuguese conversations fading until it was only his voice and my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand the nights I spent on cold stone steps, the days I scavenged for scraps, the fear that wrapped around me like chains. But I couldn't. I only stared at him, my hands gripping the cloth so tightly it nearly tore. Inside, a storm raged. Because despite everything, the betrayal, the abandonment, the cruelty, he was still my son. My boy. The one I had sacrificed everything for. The one I had carried through sickness, through poverty, through loneliness. The boy who once drew pictures of us under the sun. My love for him hadn't vanished. It clung stubbornly to me like a wound that refused to close. But that love now warred with something else, something heavier. A grief so sharp it felt like loss, except the person wasn't dead. He was standing right in front of me, alive, speaking, yet he felt farther away than ever. Michael leaned against the counter, trying to mask his discomfort with a shrug. Come home with me, Mom. Enough of this running off. You made your point. Everyone's been worried. Dad's been asking about you. His eyes flickered, betraying the lie. His father hadn't cared in decades, and Michael knew it. Still, he used the words like tools, trying to pull me back into his orbit. I searched his face for any sign of remorse, any glimpse of the boy I once knew. But all I saw was defensiveness, the need to control the story, the refusal to take responsibility. To him, what happened wasn't betrayal. It was inconvenience. It was me overreacting, me turning his joke into a tragedy. My heart ached with the realization. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here because I hadn't followed the script he expected. He had abandoned me, and yet somehow I was the one who had broken the rules. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. The part of me that longed to run into his arms battled against the part that remembered hunger, fear, humiliation. And as I stood there staring at him, I understood something I hadn't before. Love and betrayal can exist in the same breath. You can want to hold your child and never want to see him again. All in the same heartbeat. I forced myself to breathe. The cafe was watching now, though they didn't understand the words. They could feel the tension, the sharp crackle of something raw unfolding in their quiet corner. My son leaned closer, lowering his voice. Don't make this bigger than it is, Mom. Let's just move past it. Okay, move past it. The words tasted bitter, heavy with dismissal. He wanted to erase what he had done, to smooth it over with half-truths and shallow excuses. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The woman who had begged for scraps, who had prayed in cold pews, who had rebuilt herself piece by piece in a foreign country. She could not move past it. She could only face it. I didn't answer him then. I couldn't. My silence stretched, and in that silence, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Annoyance. Frustration. Maybe even fear. He had expected me to crumble, to run back into the role I had always played. The forgiving mother, the endless well of sacrifice. But the woman standing before him was no longer the same. And though I hadn't yet decided how to respond, one truth had already settled deep inside me. This was not the end of the story. This was only the beginning of a reckoning. That night, after he found me in the cafe, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed in my head. Not because they carried truth, but because of how hollow they sounded. It was just a joke. You're too sensitive. Come home. He had spoken as if nothing had happened. As if months of abandonment and silence could be washed away with a shrug. But something gnawed at me. Something inside me whispered that there was more beneath the surface, more than thoughtlessness or cruelty disguised as humor. The next morning, I saw him again. He waited outside the cafe, his arms folded, restless, impatient. He had that same posture he always had when he wanted something from me, a stance that reminded me of when he was younger and stood outside my room, asking for money he swore he'd return, favors he promised he'd repay. I walked past him, but he followed, his voice sharp. Why are you acting like this? He asked. Why are you making me look bad? You left without a word, and now everyone thinks I did something terrible to you. I stopped in my tracks. His concern wasn't for me. It was for his image, the way others saw him. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a rising fury I had long kept buried. I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes told me everything. He wasn't here to heal what had broken. He was here to salvage his reputation, to protect himself. Later that day, the truth surfaced, not from his mouth, but from whispers I was never meant to hear. One of his friends, the very ones who had driven away that night in Spain, had come with him to Portugal. I overheard their careless conversation in the alley behind the cafe. They spoke in low tones, but anger sharpened my hearing, made every word cut deep. She was never supposed to stay gone this long, one said, laughing under his breath. We just wanted him free of her. Always hovering, always embarrassing him. She was in the way. The words knocked the breath out of me. My own son had been a part of it. The cruel laughter, the abandonment. It hadn't been a mistake, not even a reckless joke. It had been deliberate. They wanted to be rid of me. I was a burden, a shame, an inconvenience. And then, like shards of glass piercing through memory, the pieces fell into place. The questions about my bank accounts, the suggestions Michael had made about transferring control of my savings, to make things easier, the pressure to sign papers, the insistence that I didn't need to worry about finances anymore. At the time, I thought it was clumsy care, a son trying to take responsibility, but now I saw it for what it was. He hadn't just wanted freedom from me. He had wanted control of what little I had left. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My love for him, fierce and unyielding for so long, buckled under the weight of this truth. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated. Planned. He hadn't stumbled into cruelty. He had chosen it. He had looked at his own mother and decided she was disposable. That night I sat alone in my rented room, the air heavy with silence. My hands shook as I held a photograph of him as a boy, missing teeth, arms around my neck, eyes bright with innocence. I pressed the picture to my chest, and for the first time I allowed myself to grieve, not for the boy who once was, but for the man who now stood in his place. My tears weren't for what he had done, but for what I finally admitted. I no longer recognized my son. Heartbreak, sharp and merciless, coursed through me. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The sobs quieted, replaced by a cold, steady calm. For years I had given everything, my time, my health, my money, my heart. And for what? To be cast aside, to be mocked, to be used. That night, resolve was born from ruin. I whispered into the darkness, my voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. I will not be broken. Not by him. Not by anyone. I folded the photograph carefully, placed it in a drawer, and closed it with finality. The boy in the picture was gone, and the man he had become had shown me exactly who he was. My love would never vanish completely. It was the curse of motherhood, but it would no longer blind me. The truth had surfaced and it cut me open. But in the wound I found clarity. I would no longer wait for apologies that would never come. I would no longer chase a son who had chosen betrayal over blood. My life was no longer his to control. And though he didn't know it yet, the reckoning had already begun. When Michael came back to the cafe the next morning, I was ready. I wasn't trembling anymore. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I wasn't even angry. What sat inside me was something stronger than anger. It was certainty. He walked in with that same restless energy, the kind of swagger that said he still believed he had power over me. He leaned across the counter, lowering his voice like we were conspirators instead of mother and son. Let's stop this nonsense, he said. Pack your things. We'll fly home together. People are starting to talk, and this whole act of yours, living here, working in some cafe, it's embarrassing. It's not who you are. I wiped the counter slowly, deliberately, and when I finally looked at him, my voice was steady. You're right, I said. It's not who I was, but it is who I am now. And I won't be going back with you. The smirk slipped from his face. He thought I was bluffing. He always thought I was bluffing. For years, he had relied on my forgiveness, my weakness, my endless giving. He didn't yet realize those days were gone. I told him calmly, each word measured, final. I have moved my life here. I've already transferred everything. My accounts, my savings, my home. Portugal is mine now. My future is here. And you no longer have access to me, to my support, to my sacrifices, to anything. He blinked, confusion giving way to disbelief, then fury. You can't do that, he snapped, his voice rising. You owe me. After everything, after raising me, you don't just cut me off like that. What about family? What about loyalty? I took off my apron, folded it neatly, and set it aside. Family doesn't abandon each other on a dark street in a foreign country. Loyalty doesn't use a mother's love as currency. You taught me that lesson yourself. For a moment, silence stretched between us. The kind of silence that weighs more than words ever could. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply told him the truth and let it stand unshakable. He had always thrived on my reaction, my tears, my begging, my forgiveness. But now I gave him nothing. Just quiet, immovable finality. His fists clenched at his sides. His face flushed red. He sputtered half-formed protests, excuses, demands, and then, realizing nothing he said could bend me, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the cafe. The door slammed so hard the glass rattled, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I watched my son leave, and felt no urge to follow. He was furious, yes, but more than that, he was powerless. He had lost the one thing he believed he would always control, me. I stood there in the stillness that followed, the quiet humming of the cafe filling the space he had left behind. And in that moment, I knew that revenge didn't always come in storms or fire. Sometimes the sharpest revenge is silence. Sometimes it is choosing your own peace over someone else's chaos. Sometimes it is the simple act of walking away and never looking back. So I returned to my work. I served coffee. I wiped tables. I smiled at strangers who had become friends. And deep inside, I carried a freedom I had never known before. If you're still watching, give this video a like, subscribe, and share it. So many parents are silenced after betrayal. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far this message travels. In the quiet that followed his departure, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's mood or choices, but the kind that comes from within. For so long, I had measured my worth by how much I gave, how much I endured, how much I was willing to sacrifice. But standing there in that small cafe in Portugal, apron folded neatly on the counter, I realized that my worth was never his to define. It was mine, and it always had been. I thought back to that cobblestone street in Spain. The echo of laughter as the car drove away. The sting of being left behind like I was nothing. That moment had nearly broken me. And yet, it was also the moment that rebuilt me, because if I had never been abandoned, I might never have discovered the strength to walk my own path. Sometimes revenge doesn't come with shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it doesn't come with dramatic confrontations, or the satisfaction of seeing someone fall. Sometimes it's simply choosing yourself, choosing to rise, choosing to protect your peace, choosing to live fully even when someone else tried to strip you down to nothing. The greatest revenge, I realized, was not to make him hurt the way he hurt me. The greatest revenge was to show him that he could no longer control my happiness, my choices, or my future. I began to see my life not as something shattered, but as something reborn. I had survived hunger, fear, and loneliness in a place where I didn't even speak the language. I had carved out a new home, built friendships that lifted me, and found work that gave me dignity. Most importantly, I had learned to stand without leaning, to breathe without begging, to live without apology. My son might have expected me to come crawling back, broken and desperate. Instead, he found me standing taller than I ever had before. And while he left with anger burning in his eyes, I stayed behind with freedom burning in my soul. In the end, it wasn't about punishing him. It was about reclaiming myself. And in that choice, I found a kind of power I had never known existed. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Resilience is not born in comfort. It is born in the moments you are left with nothing but yourself, and you discover that yourself is more than enough. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. And self-worth is not measured by what others see in you, but by what you choose to see in yourself. I walked out of that cafe into the sunlight, the streets alive with voices I could barely understand, and for the first time in decades, I smiled not because of what I gave to someone else, but because of what I had finally given to me. Independence, strength, and peace. If you've made it this far, thank you. Please like, subscribe, and share this story. It helps me keep telling the untold stories of strong women. And before you go, comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far this truth has reached.